Okay, the next thing we did was we did a full wax up of the anterior teeth, and mostly concentrating on the labial surfaces. After that, we're going to make a matrix. The labial matrix is constructed as such. We are going to make just a facial matrix all the way up to the incisal edge. If we went over the incisal edge, we're going to use a blade and we're going to cut it right along the incisal edge and the cusp tips of the posteriors. After that, we are going to cut a dovetail into the index and cut off the incisal third of the teeth that we're working on. The dovetail is so that we can remove and replace the incisal portion of the index. This way, when we put it in, it won't easily fall off towards the occlusion. So we can just slide it out and then check to make sure that the space is adequate between our posts that we're going to wax and the facial borders of the teeth. So at this point, we're going to break off the wax up and we will replace the matrix to make sure it is an exact fit. Once we confirm that, we're going to take the tie bases and we're going to place them in the implant replicas. We are going to have to make sure that the lobes on the implant replicas match up with the lobes on the tie base. So we're going to observe the lobe on the implant replicas and try to align them when we place them in. And we may have to rotate them a little bit until it falls into the implant replica. And then, instead of using the small screws, we're going to use the waxing screws. The waxing screws are these long screws that will help us create the channel for the final screws. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm that these tie bases are seated on the implants, and we can do that by slightly lifting up the tissue and confirming that the tie base here is mating directly with the implant replica there. If it doesn't meet, it will look like this. It will have a space such as this. And once we align those little lobes, then it will close down like that. And then we will tighten up the screw and replace the tissue. And we will do this on both sides. We're going to lift this up and we will see that the tie base is down all the way. Next thing we do is we will place our matrix on the model with both pieces and make sure that these posts come out lingually from the incisal edge. In this case they do. So we know that these implants were placed in such a way that even if we made screw retained crowns with these holes will come out to the lingual of the incisal edge. So in this case the dentist will have the option of making either a screw retained bridge or a cement retained restoration. In this case we're going to make cement retained restorations, which means that we're going to have to make custom implant abutments. The custom implant abutments we will design according to this matrix, and we will make sure that the abutments leave at about 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters space for the final restoration. So to start off the waxing of the abutments, we're going to place a small amount of lubricant on the waxing screws. But only on the waxing screws and not on the tie bases, because we want the wax to adhere to the tie bases. So when we start the wax up, we're going to start waxing by adding wax to the very base of the titanium abutment. Want to make sure that wax adheres very well so that when we remove the tie base along with the wax up, the wax doesn't break away, the abutment doesn't break away from the wax. So the abutment doesn't break away from the tie base, since the abutment will be made out of wax. Eventually we will remove the waxing screw, which is why we wanted to put some lubricant on it, so when we start unscrewing it, it won't get stuck to the wax. And this way the wax will be released and we will be left with a wax channel so that we continue waxing the implant abutment. The wax channel should be thick enough so that when we unscrew the waxing screw, it doesn't bend or break. And it will also have to be thick enough that we can add wax to without melting it. We also want to make sure, right now we're waxing it a little bit taller than necessary. Eventually we're going to have to cut these channels shorter because we want to make sure that we're able to wax the linguals of these posts to be in the proper contour of what an actual preparation would be. But we will see that at a slightly later time, later in the video. So as we can see, we built up a pretty good amount of wax around the waxing screw, and hopefully this will be thick enough to withstand the torsional forces when we take out the waxing screw. So we're going to wait until this cools down a little bit. And we're going to very carefully turn the waxing screw. You see how that broke a little bit? That's where the wax was a little bit thin, and we may not have waited enough time for it to cool down, so it was still weak there. Let's try this one. This one came pretty good. So now we're going to take these out. If it breaks a little bit at the tip, it won't matter too much. And then we will hold this channel down while we remove the waxing screw. Then we're going to take the final screw and put it inside the hole, and it should fit down perfectly. Then we're going to screw it down, and we'll do the same on the other one. Now the other one broke apart a little bit more, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna wax it a little bit more. So we screw it back down, and we'll add some more wax in that area. If we want to speed up the cooling, we can use a little bit of compressed air. If we want to speed up the cooling of that wax, we can always use some compressed air. Or we can just blow on it. Let's try it again. Looks like this just keeps breaking. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to remove this screw and clean it off a little bit, and we'll add a little bit more lubricant. And we'll try to do this again. Okay, now that we're done with the channels, we're going to put our matrix back, and we're gonna take a look at the space that we have available. So these posts are going to have to be built out towards the facial contours of the teeth, keeping in mind that we need 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters of space in order to fabricate our final restoration. We can use our incisal matrix to gauge the height of each post. So we're going to start to build out the wax toward the labial first. making sure that our post is aimed to be towards the center of the tooth. Wrapped around the long axis of the tooth. If you remember the long axis, it's a line that goes through the center of the tooth both mesiodistally and labiolingually. You can work on both of them at the same time, leaving one to cool while building out the other. And kind of switching back and forth. Once we feel we built it out enough, we remove the index and fill in towards the gingival. We may have to be careful depending on the kind of wax we're using so that we don't melt the little channel that we built for the screw. Now we need to remember that this is a tooth preparation, so we do not build this up to the contours of a tooth. This needs to have a slight taper to it, and both of these preparations need to be parallel so that the bridge can be removed without any issues. Later on, we're going to double check the parallelism using a surveyor, just like we would analyze a partial denture for undercuts. As we're waxing these posts, we also must think about the angle the dentist will use to place the restoration, which will be most likely slightly from the labial towards the gingival. So from the front and up, which will be a slightly diagonal angle from the front of the patient. So keeping that in mind, we need to make sure that the posts are angled in such a way that this will be possible. As you notice, we're going back and forth between posts to maximize on time. Letting one cool while building the other one. Periodically checking to see how we're doing with the matrix. As we can see, the incisal is a little bit close, so we're gonna have to probably pare that back a little bit. And we take a look at the lingual. On the lingual surface, these channels here that we built for the screw are much further out than the linguals of the incisors. And if we take a look at the canine has also a slope which we will have to mimic on this side here. Right now we're just gonna use our eyes and kind of approximate these angles here. Now we have to be very careful, especially if we're using a fragile wax, so that we don't break our post. So if we're using a fragile wax, it might be a good idea to soften it a little bit so that we can more easily trim it back. As we trim it, we can support the other side with our fingers so that when we exert pressure with the instrument, we don't crack the wax forward. And instead of putting a lot of pressure and carving the wax fast, we're better off using less pressure and carving it slower. That's why it's a good idea if we soften up the wax a little bit on the surface and then carve it back. Use some compressed air to blow out the residue of the wax so that we can actually observe where we are carving. The ideal amount is to be just anterior to the lingual surface of the adjacent tooth. As we can see, we're getting closer. This distal wall is still a little bit too far forward, so we're going to carve that back a little bit more. Gonna heat it up first and then use our instrument to slowly carve it back down. As we see, our little channel did its job, and it gave us a little hole so that we can access the screw. And we just carefully smooth the wax. Let's put our matrix back, see where we are. Looks like we're gonna have to take away a little bit more from the labial here. Now putting pressure on the front, so we're gonna have to have reciprocal pressure from the lingual so that we don't break the wax up. Check it again. So now we have just about enough space. We're gonna check the length. The length is still a little bit too much, so we're going to remove some length from the incisor. I'm gonna check again. As you can see, we're better off checking it. Sometimes you can, if you're careful, you can use the matrix at the same time to remove some incisal length. As we can see, this is not exactly in the middle, so we can take a little bit from the distal and add a little bit to the mesial. So first we're going to add to the mesial a little bit. And then we're going to take away from the distal very carefully. And double check. Maybe a little bit more. We can remove a little bit from mesial cervical and add a little bit more to the incisal 2/3. And then just fill in missing areas from the labial. We notice we have some undercuts right in there, so we're going to add a little bit of wax to fill this in. Wherever we think that we have an undercut, at this point we can correct it. Then move on to the adjacent preparation and kind of try to align it as best you can without the surveyor for now. We can remove some of this lingual here. Since this is a canine, we can leave a little bit more than the central, but it still should have a diagonal look to it. Remember to be careful not to overheat it. You see, I overheated it a little bit, so some of that wax went in here. So we have to remove that, otherwise we can't get in there to remove the screw. So let's blow out the debris a little bit, some compressed air, making sure that there's nothing else in there. We can soften up a little bit more, just have to be careful not to overdo it. We can see over here there's a little bit of an undercut, so we're going to fill that in. Double check our matrix, incisal, looks like we got a good amount of space. Maybe the canine could be a little shorter, so we're gonna shorten that a little bit. And maybe even round it slightly. So we should be good with that. Remove the matrix. In the next step, we're going to remove the posts. Fill up these sulci so that we know exactly where our tissue level is. Our margins need to be dropped about 1.5 millimeters to about 1 millimeter under the gum. So to do that, first we must know exactly where the gum level is, and to do that we're going to just fill up the sulcus around the teeth to give us a demarcation exactly where the gingiva ends. After that's completed, we're going to remove the posts. And after we remove the posts, we remove the gingiva. You've got to make sure you completely undo the screw. So to know exactly when we undo the screw, we unscrew it, and when we hear these little clicks, then we know that the screw is completely unscrewed. So now we can gently rock the posts out. And we can remove the gum tissue, saving it, putting it aside because we're going to need it later. Now we're going to look at the posts, and as you can see, whatever's under the gingiva is kind of rough, so we need to remove this concavity and fill in this area. We need to cause a slight impingement to the gum. Impingement is another word for a little pressure, so that it kind of bulks out and gives a natural appearance to the tooth. Please be sure not to disturb your tissue level margin, because that is what we're going to use as a reference point to where we're going to drop the margin to. We're going to need to make sure that that margin is about 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters lower than our gingival margin. And that is because the dentist needs to be able to remove the excess cement. If that margin is dropped too low below the gum, the excess cement will be very difficult to remove for the dentist. And sometimes they may even leave some cement down there causing infection. So what I'm doing right now is I'm adding some wax, maybe even a little bit excess, so that we can carve it down to a straight profile. Some dentists may prefer to leave a concavity, and some dentists may even prefer to leave more of a convexity in this area. These things should be clarified by the dentist, or the dentist will leave specific instructions to how this is to be done. For this class, we're going to stick to a very straight profile, straight from the gingival margin to the titanium base. So at this point, we're going to straighten the profile. And as you can notice, all of the wax is taken away until we reach the titanium base. So that's what it should look like. Now we're going to do the next one. Make sure you melt the wax all the way down to the titanium base. Okay, now we can wait for it to cool down a bit, or we can accelerate it with some compressed air. And we straighten up the profile. Remember, be patient. It's better to do more strokes with less pressure, because we reduce the chances of breaking the wax. Okay, now that the subgingival portions are good, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this margin and carve it down to about 1 millimeter or so below. That would make it just about to there. If you guys want, you can mark it all the way around and just take it all the way down. Just remember not to put it too far down, because then the dentist is going to have a lot of problems taking out the cement after it's set. Also remember, when you're carving this down, don't go in too deep, because then you're going to end up with an undercut at the gingival area. But this design will most likely be for a zirconium bridge, so a good preparation for that is a chamfer, because we don't want to make a margin that's too thin like we would for a PFM. So now this is our central incisor, and as you can see, the marginal areas just about match up. Maybe they're a little bit lower than the gingival margin of the adjacent tooth, and the gingival margin will allow us to widen the gingival portion of this tooth enough to make it look very similar with its adjacent pair. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the canine. And we're going to do the same with the canine. If we went in too far, causing an undercut, then we could probably take the undercut out by removing some wax from the preparation itself. Any irregularities could be filled in at this point. There was a slight undercut there. There's another little undercut here that we're gonna fill in. This is an irregularity, so we're gonna smooth that out. Take out some more of these undercuts. And then we're gonna place it back. And there we go. Looks like there may be some little bit of divergence between the two. So we're gonna check that out with the surveyor. At this point we're gonna take these out and double check the tissue. I'm gonna put this in, see if we're down far enough. This one we can take it further down onto the gum. And this one, I think this one we're okay. Can do maybe a little more on the labial surface. So we're gonna take a little more from the labial. Also remember that we can do further adjustments to the margins after we pressed the posts. So we're okay with this. So the next one, let's take some more away from here. So like I said before, if you want, you can mark it all the way around like so, and use this line as a slight reference point when you're actually removing some of your margin. So you can just go down to this line. This is about 1 millimeter under the gum. So as you can see the reference line there. All the way around. So let's start removing some of this. Nice and slow. Can deepen the chamfer a little bit more. Just try not to do an undercut. Okay, let's try it back in the model. Okay, so now we're under the gum all the way around. And we're going to double check with the surveyor. And we're going to put these in without the gum so that the gum doesn't keep kicking up these posts. Okay, now we put the model on the surveyor. So we're going to take an analyzing rod and make sure that these are parallel. Now, as we know, the dentist will probably be placing these restorations in the mouth from the front and from the bottom, so the angle should be going about a slight diagonal. That should be the placement angle of the restoration. So this model should be tilted in such a way that that angle is made possible. So we're going to check with the analyzing rod to make sure that we don't have any undercuts. Make sure that these posts are down. We could even screw them down. If we screw them down, we will have to be extremely careful though, so that we don't break the wax ups. Okay, now that the restorations are screwed down, we can analyze them carefully. The distal portion is okay. Mesial portion is okay. The distal portion is okay on this one. And the mesial portion, that's we got a little bit of an undercut there, so it's kind of tilted. So the next thing we can do is we can tilt the base a little bit. Carefully. And see if we can get rid of these undercuts. There's a little bit of an undercut there, but we can get rid of that by just carving away a little bit. Now let's see the labial portions of these teeth. You got a bit of an undercut there. We don't have any there. So we're gonna tilt this back a little bit, like so. Raise the analyzing rod. Okay, so now we don't have an undercut there. We don't have an undercut there. Now we're gonna go back to this view. We're good there. We're good there. Let's raise up this analyzing rod. We have a little bit, it's a little too parallel there. So what we're going to do is take away a little bit from the distal of the canine and take away a little bit from the mesial of the central. Now the lingual portion of them is not an issue at all, since they are all tilted forward. The only thing that we may have to work out a little bit is check the distal lingual there. Gonna have to check the distal lingual. No, this is the distal lingual. The other one was the mesiolingual. We check that. The distal lingual, mesiolingual of the canine is okay, and the distal lingual of the canine is okay. So the only thing we'll have to do is take away a little bit from the distal of the canine and the mesial of the central. Okay, so let's take away a little bit from the distal lingual of the canine. And okay, let's take away a little bit from the distal of the canine and the mesial of the central. It was mostly from the center because the wall didn't seem to be straight enough. But we'll lean this wall a little bit more distally. This way we know it's not going to cause a problem later on. And we just kind of straighten up all the areas that seems to be rough, and there we are. These are our posts. Now the only thing that's left to do is check the articulator. Now when we check the articulation, we notice that we don't have a lot of space. So now we're going to have to relieve some space on the canine and make some more space on the central incisor. So we're going to take away from the lingual. I'm going to heat up this wax a little bit here so it's easier to carve down. Since this wax is on the fragile side, it's always good to make double sure that we don't break the wax up. So on the lingual of this, we're going to have to make some more space. We want to make sure that this post ends up within the confines of the crown. And if it happens to be getting on the thin side while you're waxing up, we can always leave it a little thicker and remove some more material after we pressed the post. Let's double check. Could still remove a little bit more, especially from the canine. You can round all the sharp edges a little bit. And let's double check. And the canine is still a bit close, especially on the mesial. So let's take a little more from there. Okay, so now we should be good with both posts, and we're finished. Now since the wax up's finished of the posts, let's move on to the wax up of the molar.